Hey friends, thanks so much for tuning in. Every now and then, someone comes on the scene who makes you say, this is a person who everyone should know about. This is work that everyone should see. And in fact, if CNBC were not Mockingbird mainstream media and they were truth media, they would play John Titus's video, Fed Audit Shocker. They come from Planet Klepto. John Titus is joining us right now. How are you, John?
I'm good, Sean. Thanks for the introduction. I appreciate it.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on, John. Your YouTube channel is Best Evidence. I sure hope that everybody will look that up right now, YouTube, Best Evidence, and subscribe to John Titus's channel. I'm telling you guys, Fed Audit Shocker, they came from Planet Klepto, is one of the most important videos that I've seen in the past year or two, maybe one of the most important videos I've seen in the last 5 years. John says, and I quote, "Criminals are running the Federal Reserve and using it as both a sword to steal money and a shield to conceal their crimes," end quote. John, where would you like to begin? Because I really want to take people through this forensic evidence that you outline in your video. They come from Planet Klepto.
Well, all right, let me take a step back. I started the channel this year, and one of the reasons I started it is that I wanted to use evidence. A lot of people make allegations, and sometimes they're backed up and sometimes they're not. And what I wanted to do was to put up a channel that relied on the purest form of evidence available. So, for example, in the latest video, Planet Klepto, I go into a Federal Open Market Committee transcript from June of 2009, 2009 being the latest year that's available for the transcripts. The minutes, of course, are released, as they come and go, but the transcripts aren't released for 5 years. So I went into the June 2009 transcript, and the transcript it's a transcript of the proceedings of the FOMC meeting, which in the June case was about 70 people in there. And it also includes presentation materials. And so my goal with the video was to walk people through the transcript and through the exhibits to show, in the Fed's own words, what the Fed is doing. And that's really the backdrop for that video. Now, as far as what that transcript shows, there's a few things. The first thing you notice is that the Fed's projections for the economy and for what the Fed itself is going to do are way off the mark. For example, the Fed projects, and remember, 2009 is when the Fed really ramped up the large-scale asset purchases, meaning big purchases by the Fed of mortgage-backed securities and Treasuries. So what the Fed was doing was basically printing money, which is really just an accounting entry, and buying assets from the banks. And the Fed was projecting, well, we're going to ramp up purchases way high through the end of 2009, and they knew that this was controversial because they were going to double or even triple the balance sheet. But they said, well, don't worry about it because we have an exit plan, and we're going to unwind these asset purchases over time, and by 2015, which is now, they'll be back to normal levels. Well, that didn't happen. And what the video shows is the reason that didn't happen is that the Fed was lying about having an exit plan. It is right there in the transcript in black and white. Any number of Fed members complain, hey, there's no exit plan here. I thought we were going to meet and talk about exit strategies. There's no exit strategies here. And somebody chimes in and says, well, I think we need to convince people that we have an exit plan, even though we really don't.
That's right. And you note in your video, by May of 2015, the Fed held $2.46 trillion in treasuries and $1.73 trillion in mortgage-backed securities. And the key, you note, is the mortgage-backed securities and the Fed's role as, quote, an accessory after the fact to one of the biggest financial crimes of all time, end quote. So that's 2015. Let's rewind time, though. Let's go back to 2008. The crisis, in which these criminal bankers got up before Congress and said, we need a bailout or the whole system's coming down. And the taxpayers gave these criminal banks $700 billion. But that wasn't enough to save them, was it?
No, it was not, because we later learned that it wasn't only the Treasury and $700 billion in TARP that the banks got. At the same time, but we didn't know it back then, at the same time, the Fed was going crazy with short-term loans. And a GAO audit, I think, came out in August of 2010 and revealed that it wasn't just $700 billion from the Treasury, that the Federal Reserve itself had lent out $16 trillion in
Right.
short-term loans to these guys.
Right.
I think 16 trillion was the peak value. You know, the aggregate of all the loans will fluctuate over time, but it had reached $16 trillion. So we knew that the crisis was much more severe than a $700 billion crisis. It was an order of magnitude or more bigger than what we were led to believe.
Right. And these fraudulent mortgage-backed securities, as you note, are the key. So let's just remind people what was going on. Back in the day, I think in 2008, Merrill Lynch was selling their mortgage-backed securities for 5 cents on the dollar, right? And as you note, they were lucky to get that because the damn things were worthless. So what happened? The Fed stepped in, and for the well-connected buddies on Wall Street, for the insiders, the Fed was buying them at what? Full value? I mean, to the extent that they bought $1.73 trillion of these mortgage-backed securities. Why don't you tell us about mortgage-backed securities and why this is truly the crux and the smoking gun of the criminality?
Yeah, okay. So let's go back to 2008. All these banks are holding mortgage-backed securities, and this is really how the scales fell from my eyes, because I was investing in certain banks and their stock price was behaving in a way that it should not have had their balance sheets been accurate. So I started to really drill down, and it didn't take very long for me to realize there's an enormous problem here. There's something fundamentally wrong with mortgage-backed securities. What a mortgage-backed security is basically a pool of loans. So you have all these borrowers. Typically, you have 5,000 mortgages. They are pooled together by an investment bank. The mortgages are paying interest at a pretty high rate. Subprime loans, the worse the loan, the higher the rate. And then the investment bank that pools these loans would go out to investors and say, would you like to buy this mortgage-backed security? It is yielding a very high percentage rate. These are AAA rated securities. They are as safe as U.S. Treasuries, and investors were all over them. Well, it turned out, of course, that was a Ponzi scheme, because what was propping up all those mortgages for so long, especially in the case of subprime loans and really Alt-A loans, which are even worse, what was propping them up was the fact that houses were appreciating. And so someone who didn't have the income to support a loan could go ahead and make payments on that loan, because what they were doing was refinancing their house, because the house would go up. The homeowner, let's say the house went from, I'm going to make up a number, from $200,000 to $250,000. Well, now on the borrower's balance sheet, the borrower is showing an extra $50,000 in equity. And what borrowers were doing was turning around and parlaying that $50,000 in additional equity back into principal and refining. And it was a basic Ponzi scheme. And so this went on for years until home prices stopped appreciating. And when that happened, the value of mortgage-backed securities began to plummet, and it cascaded. And so by July of 2008, which is roughly 2 months before the crisis really hit, the crisis hit on September 15, 2008 with Lehman Brothers. And nobody really knew how much the mortgage-backed securities were worth. I mean, what were they worth as, a par? How much were they worth on the dollar? Well, Merrill Lynch was in big trouble that year, and basically had a fire sale that summer trying to dump some of its mortgage-backed securities to generate cash. They sold, I think, $30 billion worth to $30 billion par to a company called Lone Star. Lone Star paid 5.4 cents on the dollar cash, and that was really how much they were worth. And the reason the mortgage-backed securities weren't worth anything, it wasn't only that they weren't truly AAA securities. I mean, that's the headline problem. And when you see documentaries and you see a lot of exposés on the mortgage crisis, you see that, oh well, they weren't really rated AAA. They had a AAA rating, but they weren't worth that much.
Right.
They were maybe triple B. That's really the tier 2 problem. The tier 1 problem, and the gorilla in the room that nobody wants to talk about, is the fact that for a great many of the mortgage-backed securities, maybe even the majority, they're not backed by any mortgages, because
Right.
the investment banks that were pooling them were either A, selling mortgages before they were even originated, which is per se fraud.
Right.
And so the mortgage-backed securities are empty. Or B, in the case, I think Deutsche Bank got caught doing this. They were selling mortgage-backed securities more than once.
Right.
You try doing that with your car. Go and sell them the title more than one time and see what happens.
Right.
And so that was really the end. Once the bankers lost, everybody sort of knew that this fraud was, I don't want to say inherent because that's a strong word, but once the fraud was learned and understood to be as pervasive as it was, the house of cards came down. And remember, that was the initial pitch by Hank Paulson back in September 2008. He said, we need $700 billion because we're going to buy the troubled assets. We need to buy the troubled assets. That's what he was talking about, which is the mortgage-backed securities. And in fact, that's what the legislation was initially called, the Troubled Asset Relief Program. That's what he was talking about. And he said, if we do not buy these troubled assets immediately, the whole system would crumble. And he was lying because they didn't use the $700 billion to buy the troubled assets. They put it in their pocket and paid bonuses, and the system didn't collapse. They only got around to buying the troubled assets really in 2009. And that's where my video picks up in 2009 when they finally get around to buying the troubled assets, the mortgage-backed securities, and getting that toxic sludge off of the balance sheet of the banks, which then frees up the banks to pay bonuses.
Well, and all of this makes me wonder, John, and we don't have time to get into this aspect of the fraud, but how many of us are still paying mortgages to a lender that we believe holds our title to our homes, when in fact, God only knows where those titles are and how many of those titles are wrapped up into derivatives and wrapped up into mortgage-backed securities and hidden in a closet somewhere, where, even if you ask to see your title, your lender may not be able to prove it. The whole system is so riddled with fraud that it defies belief. And you note in your video, quote, the Fed never planned to unwind these programs, which conceal Wall Street theft, which is unprecedented in scale. Let's talk about these reserves, right? If the Federal Reserve has, 2.5 trillion in reserves, you call it oceans of cash, which have flowed into bank vaults and drowned the U.S. economy. Now the Fed tries to explain away the Frankenstein it has created, end quote. Why are these reserves killing the economy? Is it because the Federal Reserve is paying its criminal banking buddies interest on these reserves?
Well, I think the thing to look at, and I talk about this at the sort of the front end of the video, is let's talk about where reserves come from. Here's how it works. The Fed prints up $1.7 trillion. It pays the banks $1.77 trillion in exchange for their mortgage-backed securities. Okay, so now you have $1.7 trillion in the hands of the banks. The banks then turn around and take that $1.7 trillion and they park it, they lend it back to the Federal Reserve, which in turn pays interest of 0.25% to the banks. And so that's the figure you see on the asset side of the, actually that's on the liability side. You see a liability of $1.7 trillion on the Fed's balance sheet, representing the $1.7 trillion that the banks, which got the $1.7 trillion from the Fed, lent back to the Fed. And now the Fed owes the bank back $1.7 trillion. On the asset side of the balance sheet, you see $1.7 trillion in mortgage-backed securities. Well, you can see the problem there because the mortgage-backed securities, as we just saw, are worthless. They're garbage. And so what's happened is that, I think that those you'll never see those mortgage-backed securities because the Fed is opaque. They're not going to let you take a look at those mortgage-backed securities. The most you'll see is a spreadsheet maintained by the New York Federal Reserve providing some top-level detail about the mortgage-backed security, who the issuer was, what the interest rate was, what the term was, yada, yada, yada. But you won't see the paper itself. And the reason you won't see the paper itself is that paper, if you were to wade through the papers, what you would find is that a great many of those mortgages were actually, they were pooled and sold before the mortgages originated. And so the people who did that would have no defense to basically a criminal fraud charge. I mean, you were selling mortgages before there were mortgages? Are you kidding me? You're going to jail. And so those papers are going to remain, they're going to stay at the Fed forever.
Okay. Well, so these criminals have printed into existence 2.5 trillion, probably well more than that. The 16 trillion, as the Ron Paul audit discovered, but the 2.5 trillion that's been given to their criminal banking buddies in exchange for these worthless mortgage-backed securities has led to, and you note in your video, has led to the Fed implementing the same anti-lending policy of the late 1930s that extended the Great Depression into the teeth of World War, end quote. And the best example of that, which you also provide in your video, John, is that the birth rate of new businesses has trended down since 2008, while the death rate of existing businesses has spiked up, and the two have crossed for the first time ever. So while the Fed says that they're providing stimulus and trying to spur the economy in this country, they're lying out both sides of their mouth, because what they're doing is they're destroying the economy by printing into existence money that never hits the economy. It never hits Main Street.
Yeah, that's right. And if you look at lending, okay, just look at the whole process. Just take a step back and look at what the Fed is doing. The Fed is they're paying interest to the banks on money that the banks have deposited with the Fed. So in other words, the Fed has, and I say this in the video, the Fed has stepped into the shoes of Main Street. It is functioning as they're competing with Main Street as a borrower. The Fed is a borrower from the banks, right? It's paying interest to the banks on money that it got from the banks. Now, forget for a second that the banks themselves got that money from the Fed to begin with. But the Fed is functioning as a Main Street borrower, and for that reason, the banks don't really need to lend to Main Street. To the extent that the Fed is functioning as a Main Street borrower, the banks themselves do not need to lend to Main Street. They've got the Fed, right? The Fed's their borrower. So that's why you see for years and years and years and years in the U.S., before the Fed started paying interest on excess reserves, and the Fed started doing that in October of 2008, up until that moment, every dollar that a bank took in deposits, it turned around and lent back out in a loan. Okay, that was a one-for-one relationship from 1984, which is as far back as that data goes, up until 2008. So that went on for a long time, basically a generation, 24 years, right? Well, that stopped the minute the Fed started paying interest on excess reserves. And now what you see is that for every dollar that comes into a bank through deposits, the bank turns around and it only lends out 75 cents. Okay, that's a major dip in lending. I mean, there's now a $2.5 trillion gap between deposits, which I think are sitting at around ballpark $11 trillion. If you added up all the deposits in the U.S., it's $11 trillion. You back out $2.5 trillion, and you'll see that despite taking in $11 trillion in deposits, the banks are only lending out, $8.5 trillion. So, okay, you don't think that's going to leave a mark? I mean, $2.5 trillion, it's definitely left a mark. And the mark shows up in the birth rates of new and existing businesses. And you can see, and they were on a downtrend to begin with, because I think the U.S. made a very fatal mistake when it got out of manufacturing and decided we don't need to manufacture stuff. We were in trouble as a result of that decision already. And then the Fed comes in and basically puts a nail gun in the coffin by saying, "Oh, well, now we're going to add insult to injury by functioning as a Main Street borrower and paying banks interest on their excess reserves." And it is absolutely devastated lending. I mean, if you look at a graph of excess reserves, and you put it next to the lending gap graph, in other words, what's the gap between deposits and loans to ordinary borrowers on Main Street, it's a one-for-one correlation. It's dollar for dollar. It's right there in black and white, and you see it right in the front of that video. And that's what's going on. And it's basically, this happened in 1937, 1936. The Federal Reserve did the same thing, except back then they didn't induce borrowers, they didn't induce the banks to deposit reserves with the Fed. They required them to do so. But in other words, it's Fed meddling, however you want it. Whether the Fed requires higher deposit, whether the Fed requires higher reserves, or whether the Fed induces higher reserves with a carrot of interest payments, it's the same result. You get reduced lending, and you get basically an economy that's headed, if it's not already in, a depression.
Let me ask you this then as it relates to loans and how banks work their loans. And again, you note in your video, the death rate for existing businesses has spiked upwards, even spiking above the new business birth rate for the first time ever. This is a coffin for the U.S. economy, end quote. So how does that work? Because you and I both know that student loans, outstanding student loans exceed $1 trillion. It seems anybody, even with a part-time job, can run out and get a car loan these days. There's plenty of money out there to go buy stuff. Are they picking and choosing, though, to really strangle the real economy, the small business economy, the bread and butter, the backbone of our economy, by restricting loans to actual businesses and startups? Because if you want to buy stuff, it seems pretty easy to get a loan. And maybe it's just because I have good credit. I don't know. What are they doing, though? Are they picking and choosing on purpose in order to strangle this economy?
I think what you see is that they're doing that. Whether it's deliberate or not, I don't know. I can't speak to intent. I can just tell you what's going on. And what's going on is that you're right. There are certain types of loans that are very easy to get. You will note, though, that those loans that are easy to get are by and large securitized. In other words, we've seen the same pooling process. So you mentioned student loans. Student loans are just like mortgages now. You take a student loan, you put it into a pool of 5,000 other student loans, you create a high yield investment vehicle, you go out and you find some suckers and you sell it to them, right? The loans that are easy to securitize, those are the loans you see being made, and student loans are part of that. They're easy to securitize, they're easy to pool. Those are the loans that are being made now. Loans to small businesses aren't so easy to securitize. In fact, they're pretty much impossible because every business is different. Every business is unique. A small business loan or a business loan has a million more variables than a student loan, and it's not fungible. It's not, you can't just package them. And so basically what the Fed has done is to create a system of perverse incentives where it's bad loans are prevalent because they're easy to make and easy to securitize, and good loans, the loans you want to see, which is the loans to Main Street businesses, aren't being made, and that shows up in the death rates. I walk around and I see, say, a mattress firm. I have mattress firms all over the place, and I never see any customers in there. And when I do see customers, I'm like, how is the mattress firm making any money? People walk in, they don't give any cash, and they walk out with a mattress. Obviously, that company is not, and I'm not picking on mattress firm. There's a lot of companies just like this. Those companies aren't making money selling mattresses. They're making money selling paper.
That's interesting. Yeah, you're right.
That's how they're making their money.
Yeah, I've noticed the same thing about furniture stores. We go into these gargantuan acre-sized furniture stores with just a handful of customers, and I don't know how they can afford to keep the lights on every day, because if they're not busy on a Saturday, they're certainly not busy on a Monday. It's puzzling. This whole economy to me is puzzling. It's a 70%, 75% probably at this point, service economy, based solely on debt and death. This debt-death paradigm, which we talk about at SGT Report, is one that is in the process of dying, not only because of the unrestricted hegemony of this criminal government overseas with its criminal U.S. foreign policy, but also because of the Federal Reserve. And you note in your video, the only use for these mortgage-backed security papers now is as exhibits in criminal prosecutions. This is why the Fed never planned to part with these assets and never will, end quote. So, John, they talk about raising rates. They can't. We know that. They talk about unwinding all of this stuff and lowering their reserves and getting back to baseline. They can't. What is the end game at this point? What is the end game for the Fed? What is the end game for the people of this country that have not reined in the Fed? And what is the end game for the U.S. dollar?
I'll give you my opinion. You mentioned debt, and debt being a problem, and debt getting ever bigger. A greater and greater proportion of that debt is fraudulent. And we saw that in mortgages, and the fraud hasn't been punished. In a lot of ways, the crisis of 2008 started out as a financial crisis. And because no one has been prosecuted, because no one has been put in jail, the financial crisis has really morphed into a legal crisis. And the reason is that no one's being prosecuted, and so everybody has an incentive. Everybody who's gotten away with their crimes has now got the incentive to go out and commit more crimes. And so what you're going to see is more and more fraud, and I think that's what we're seeing. And as we've already seen with the Fed's role is really to cover up that fraud. And so as more and more frauds and more criminal frauds get perpetrated, the Fed will take more and more measures to cover those criminal frauds up. And so the notion that the Fed is going to return us back to normal, to the halcyon days of manufacturing, that's rubbish. That's not going to happen. The Fed's going to continue to cover up. I think you'll probably see QE4. I think the next big thing coming is probably negative interest rates, because remember, if the Fed can go as far as covering up crimes and give away money to criminals, the Fed can take away too. The Fed will start taking away from ordinary people. And I think that's what's coming with negative interest rates. You put your money in the bank and you're going to find that your principal is getting smaller over time because it's being taken to prop up criminals perpetrating fraud.
All right. Well, let me ask you this. Here's one thing that I do get confused by. I think many of the listeners probably do too. As we note that by May of 2015, the Fed held $2.46 trillion in Treasuries and $1.73 trillion in mortgage-backed securities. I get the $1.73 trillion in mortgage-backed securities. That I get. That's all part of the criminality. Explain to us the $2.46 trillion in Treasuries, though, because as we know, Russia and China no longer are buying this garbage paper from the Fed, and China is actively selling their Treasuries. Is this $2.46 trillion just the evidence now that the Fed is the buyer of last resort, and we should expect that number to balloon in coming years?
Well, I tell you why I didn't really drill into treasuries. Let me take a step back. One of the reason that treasuries exist to begin with is that the U.S. government spends more than it takes in, and it needs to finance that gap between spending and revenue. And the way it does that is it prints IOUs, and we call those IOUs treasuries. And the Fed was very upfront in 2009. They were going to buy more treasuries, and a lot of people accused the Fed of monetizing the debt. And Bernanke said, no, we're not monetizing the debt. Monetizing the debt simply means that rather than marketing your IOUs out on the open market and selling them to China and Japan and whoever, you instead just pay for them yourself, right? You just print out money. And Bernanke said, no. One of the reasons I didn't really go into the 2.46 trillion in treasuries is, frankly, the numbers don't really add up. I looked at the treasuries from a number of different angles, and I'm telling you right now, something doesn't smell right. There's an aroma about the treasury situation.
It should be a higher number than that, shouldn't it?
Yeah, it should be. I looked at it enough to go, you know what, this video is going to be 20 minutes to begin with. Yeah. I think I'll leave it at mortgage-backed securities, and I'll turn back to that sleeping dog a little bit later. There's a problem there.
Yeah, it's a smoking gun, and you know what? Our focus at SGT Report and on my YouTube channel now since probably 2010 has been explaining to people the real-world value and absolute critical nature of owning physical precious metals and tangible assets in a world which has turned solely criminal, at least in the Western world. There is no justice, there is no recourse, there is no punishment for the criminals, which is why they continue to commit crimes unabated. Because as you just noted in this interview, there is no punishment. The bad guys never go to jail. There are no executions like there are in China. If a banker in China defrauds and gets caught, he gets executed. In this country, if a banker defrauds, there's a revolving door. There's always room for you at the Fed or at Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan, right? And that is the nature of our criminal system, which frankly, Vladimir Putin has now laid bare for the world to see as it relates to Syria. And everybody should watch the video from RT in which Putin was asked, who created ISIS? That is a video that every single American should watch because it lays bare the truth for the entire world to see. And now the men behind the curtain have been revealed geopolitically, the people at the Pentagon, the people at the U.S. State Department, and as John Titus has revealed, the people at the Federal Reserve as well. These are criminals that need to be reined in, and they need to go to prison if we want any hope of having a future, John.
Well, you have to return the U.S. to a state of law. It is not a state of law now. In fact, in December of 2012, the Attorney General at the time, Eric Holder, expressly repudiated the rule of law by saying there are, in fact, some banks that are too big to prosecute. I mean, the rule of law simply means that the same rules apply to everybody, that no one is above the law. Mm-hmm. That has been the case not only back to the founding of the U.S. in 1776, that's been the case in Western jurisprudence back to 1215 in the Magna Carta. No one is above the law. We have the rule of, you have two choices, the rule of man or the rule of law. We are now in a system that is admitted, it's expressly admitted through Eric Holder in 2012, We're no longer a system of a rule of law. We have the rule of man, and the men controlling the system are by and large criminals. And so the outcome of a system in which criminals are above the law and you have criminal rulers is not a good one.
Yeah.
And until we return to the rule of law, you're going to see more and more fraudulent debt. But by returning to the rule of law, you will be able to eliminate a lot of this fraudulent debt, and a lot of the fraudulent debt that's really, frankly, leading to servitude. I'll use a light term, you know, uh, debt servitude of ordinary people, and it's debt servitude based on debt that's fraudulent. It's contrary to law. It's fraudulently induced, it's fraudulently sold, and it's fraudulently maintained.
Yeah, that's 100% right. And people are probably getting tired of me reading this now in the last 2 videos, but damn it, John, if I sound mad in this video, if I sound mad in this interview, it's because I am. It's because the criminality that now rules this government is destroying the nature of our republic for my children and my children's children. And frankly, it's destroying the future of people, that are listening to this interview right now, too. You're not going to be able to count on your pensions. You're not going to be able to count on your Social Security. And God knows that the way things are going right now, you're not going to be able to count on the dollar, because the future of the dollar is shaky at best. And as you know, John, every fiat currency crashes and burns at some point. And we've abused our privileges having the world's reserve currency for so long that now the world's fed up. And what I wanted to read for you, John, because you hit the nail on the head with this criminality, is that what we have now is a banana republic. A banana republic is a politically unstable country whose economy is largely dependent on exporting a limited resource product. How about dollars, John? It typically has a stratified social class, including a large impoverished working class and a ruling plutocracy of business, political, and military elites. Think Pentagon. Think Lindsey Graham. Think Hillary Clinton. This politico-economic oligarchy controls the primary sector productions to exploit the country's economy. That's what these men have done. They've exploited our economy and our world's reserve currency status. They've exploited the printing press to their own ends. And the end game, I guess, means, as you said, servitude for the people.
Well, keep in mind that a banana republic typically does not have the world's strongest military or one of the world's strongest militaries. So in a lot of ways, you see not only the attributes of a banana republic in the U.S., you also see attributes of some dictatorships and totalitarianism. Right. And that is without a doubt also going on in the U.S. It is no accident that FBI agents were taken away from investigations of white-collar criminal fraud and put onto investigations of terrorists. And now we know that a lot of these so-called terrorists were semi-retarded illiterates who were propped up by the FBI and basically induced and duped into just ludicrous plots that the FBI dreamt up.
That's right.
And, Trevor Aronson released a book in January of 2013 called Terror Factory. He details what I just mentioned in excruciating detail. And you see that more and more. A lot of times there's two sides of a coin. One side of the coin is financial fraud, and the other side is terrorism. And in fact, I'm going to touch on that in my next video. It's funny you mentioned Banana Republic, because I'm noodling with the title for my next video now. But the working title is America's Foulest Recipes, Gestapo Swirl Banana Nut Republic Zombie Muffins.
Well, that'll be a must-watch.
Yeah, it'll be good.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the FBI patsies. Absolutely. And I think everybody listening to this conversation knows that the FBI has nurtured patsies that then they try to, explain away that they saved us from terror to justify this whole police state apparatus. And they were patsies that they handled and seeded and funded and moved along down a path of certainly no real terror. And it reminds me of Webster Tarpley's book, 9/11 Synthetic Terror. I mean, how many times are the people of this country going to fall for false flag operations that strip them of more liberty? They fell for it on 9/11. The people in England fell for the London 7/7 bombings, these manipulated shooting events because they want to come after our guns. Enough is enough. I mean, they've already fleeced us of all of our money, guys. $8.5 trillion went missing out the back door of the Pentagon since 1996, and the Pentagon admits that. Enough is enough. I mean, they're fleecing us. I guess at this point, John, the only thing that I'd hang my hat on, and it's pretty sad that I have to, is that Vladimir Putin is standing up on the world stage and shining a mirror back on this government and saying, okay, you guys are saying X, here's the truth. You're saying this, here's the quantifiable evidence that proves you're lying. And the whole world sees it. I mean, maybe the average American doesn't see it, but the rest of the world, the world's leaders, they all see it.
Well, you can't just hang your hat on Vladimir Putin. I mean, there's also the American people. The American people, yeah, they're asleep in front of their televisions for the most part, 95%. But remember, the American people are slow to anger, and once they wake up, and it's the job of people like you and me and other people to get out there and spread the word and just spread the truth about what's going on, to wake people up. And people will wake up. It's just going to take time, and you have to be patient, and you have to dig your heels in for the long haul. But once people wake up, it's no accident that this country was as great as it was at one time.
Yeah.
I mean, it's happened in my lifetime.
Yeah.
I grew up in the 70s. I was a kid in the 70s and the 80s. That was a great time. And we had manufacturing, and we had good jobs, and we had honest banking back then.
Yeah.
And we had small business. Now every single industry is dominated by 5 or 6 companies, and that's it.
Yeah.
It was a great country, and it just really upsets me to no end that the country has been turned on its ear in a single generation.
Yeah.
But the people who made the country great to begin with are still out there. A lot of them have unfortunately been lulled to sleep in front of the TV and reading mainstream media, and they're being lied to.
Yeah.
And Mark Twain said it best. It's easier to fool someone than to convince them they were fooled. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the situation a lot of people, they find themselves in that situation where they can't admit to themselves they were fooled.
Yeah.
But Oliver Wendell Holmes said, even a dog knows the difference between being tripped over and being kicked. And I think once people realize they've been kicked, you're starting to see that anger simmer up. And it's a good, healthy anger. It's a good, healthy rage. I think that's welling up. And it's the idea, it's incumbent on people like you and me, to take the torch from Samuel Adams, who said, it doesn't take a majority to prevail. It takes a tireless, irate minority keen on setting brush fires in people's minds.
Yeah.
And so just don't get upset. Just keep at it. We'll win this in the long run.
Yeah, I'm nodding, John, because I'm in full agreement in this Zionist entity which has seized control, these neocons which seized control of our government and took us to these unconstitutional wars without end are now being exposed. And unless we want to happen to our country what we've seen happen in the Middle East, all of these other countries that the United States has unconstitutionally invaded, unless we want that to happen to us, we need to start speaking out, speaking truth. We need to take our government back on a local level too. And I want to call attention to my good friend Grindall61, who does remarkable work in the area of exposing UN Agenda 21. And he just did a video the other day in which he said, I am sick and tired of people saying trying to take it back on a local level doesn't work. And the reason it's important to cite that is because, as he notes in a recent video, they keep trying to get our guns, John. They haven't gotten our guns. They want to get the guns. They want stricter gun laws. Obama, takes every opportunity he has, even after the Oregon shooting. He was in front of a national TV audience an hour or two later with a prepared speech about taking our guns and citing the false flag operation in Australia that took the people of Australia's guns as, a great example of what we need to do. And it will not work. And as Grindall61 notes, they want our guns and they haven't got them. So they are not omnipotent. They are not all powerful. We, the people, still have power, and we need to exercise it every single day. And I'm going to conclude by saying at the end of your video, you hit the nail on the head. You say, and I quote, "This was all predicted to the letter when the Federal Reserve was first conceived as the National Reserve Association in 1910. It's taken a century for the Fed to destroy nearly everything and for America to learn nothing." End quote. Well, John, I think you and your exceptional video, Fed Audit Shocker, They Came from Planet Klepto, is helping wake people up to the absolute forensic truth of the criminality. And for that, I really, really want to thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, Sean. And I think, one of the things that we both need to do is to lay a record. That's one of the intents of my channel, and presumably one of yours, to lay a record so people down the road saying, what the hell happened to the U.S., they could look at these things and see, and they can put it together and figure out who's right and who's wrong.
That's right. John, tell us just a little bit about yourself before we let you go, and tell people about your YouTube channel.
Well, I was originally trained as an engineer, and then the U.S. shipped manufacturing overseas, so I became a paper-pushing lawyer. I worked in patent litigation and still work as a patent litigator. In 2011 and 2012, I made a movie called Bailout. It was a documentary, and it took a long time and was a lot of effort. But I made that. I wrote it and produced it. Produced it means I paid for it, but I didn't direct it. And so I'm always been interested in films. I've just started to learn how to use a camera and motion graphics, and so I set up a channel. And one of the reasons I set up a channel is to, as I say, lay a record, because I want people like my nephews and nieces to be able to come down the road and say, well, what was going on here? And just sort of document the decline of America, the last days of the Republic.
Well, you've done an absolutely exceptional job. Your documentary from 2012 is called Bailout, 8.7 out of 10 stars from users. That's on IMDb. Our guest has been the one and only John Titus. Guys, please, I'm begging you. If this video gets 20,000 views, then please, let's have 20,000 new subscribers over at John Titus's YouTube channel. The channel is Best Evidence. I'll put a link below. Our guest has been John Titus. John, thank you so much.
Sean, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you, John. And guys, thank you so much for tuning in. It means the world to us. We really appreciate your support at sgtreport.com, thephaser.com, and thelibertymill.com. Real news, 24/7, the antidote to corporate propaganda. Let's take our nation back. God bless and have a great week.